Hey guys, welcome back for another episode of Not the Girl Next Door. I'm your host, Meg Reynolds, and you guys know that saying, well, it wasn't a saying, it was a nursery rhyme that was like, first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby in the baby carriage. Well, I think for modern dating, we could say first comes lust, then comes limerence, then comes a huge ass therapy bill. I think that's how it goes in modern dating. The title gives anything away. We're talking about limerence, lust, love, and everything in between when it comes to dating and relationships. You know, we're nearing the end of January. We're about to be in February, the month of love, of course. And if you're part of the Snail Mail Club, the February prompts are going to explore this topic pretty much. You missed the deadline to sign up for January's, but Little Birdie told me if you sign up for February, you may just be able to still receive January's print as a special little bonus. So if you guys are interested in this topic, sign up for the club. It'll give you some journal prompts all about relationships. But the timing of this episode also could not have been more perfect because not only are we about to enter February, but season 3 of Tell Me Lies dropped last week with 3 episodes. And while not much happened, I can already see Stephen DeMarco is about to get a whole lot worse in this show. And I think this show is a perfect example of what toxic relationship dynamics and limerence and lust and all these things can do to a person. But I swear I didn't plan to drop this just because of Tell Me Lies. The timing just worked out great. But, you know, we've all been there. We meet somebody who we think is amazing. They give us the butterflies, the excitement. We feel like, oh my God, I finally found somebody who can see me. And we find ourselves daydreaming about them. And we feel like a kid again. We feel like a teenager again. And oh my God, we're so excited. Well, welcome to limerence. Oh my God, guys, this is what he does. He has to, oh my God, chaos. Okay. Do you need to go under the blanket? This is what he does, guys. My dog, oh, no, we don't want to be under the blanket. We just want to be in mommy's lap. Okay. All right. Well, this is how I'll be sitting for the rest of the episode, apparently, because my child needs me. So limerence is a lot closer to lust than it is to love because limerence is a lot closer to lust than it is to love because it's where desire meets fixation. And they're both super intense short-term feelings that involve a need for some sort of instant gratification. And so that's why I say if you're feeling limerence towards a person, more likely it's lust. And unfortunately, limerence is really never going to lead to a healthy relationship unless you both do some serious work on yourselves. I'm guilty of saying this. My friends are guilty of saying this. How many times us girls out there, or even guys too, they've probably done this, saying, but the sex is so good. And that's why you won't stop engaging with them. You're, dealing with their toxic patterns, their toxic bullshit, all of these things. And you're just like, but it's just so good in bed. That you're engaging in limerence. That's also why I say limerence leads to situationships. And I'm going to touch on that later in the episode. Something that I've talked about on this podcast before, and I think it's part of what inspired this episode is, you guys know I'm an anxious attacher. I've struggled with my anxious attachment. I've been working on it in therapy. And my last relationship, which was 4 years ago now, is largely what led me to kind of confront all these things about myself. I always say that my ex loved the idea of me. He didn't love me, the person and the woman that I was, and vice versa. I fell in love with the version of him that he showed me and not the version of him who he actually was. And so a lot of our relationship was formed out of limerence and love bombing. And while limerence and love bombing are not the same thing, they can go hand in hand in a situation. And I'll take it a step further too, in that a lot of the TV shows we grew up on, a lot of the rom-coms that we grew up on, all of these things, what we're watching in these relationship dynamics isn't actually love, it's limerence. Carrie with Mr. Big in Sex and the City, she's the idea of Mr. Big and who he is and this life that he can give her. And all of these situations, a lot of the time it's just limerence. And I think that's part of why it's become so normalized, because we're seeing it in the media, we're seeing it in movies and pop culture. And I think a lot of us are starting to understand this. And I think it's becoming talked about more, but how love is about, yes, it's a feeling, but it's also a choice. And lasting love is a choice. It's not just the feelings aren't going to maintain themselves. You have to work at it. So I will say it's better to love late than to love wrong, right? I always say, like, I'm 27 now. Statistically, I've just avoided my first divorce. And I think about the past guys, not that just that I've even actually gotten into a relationship with, but the ones that I just went on a couple dates with, ended up in a situationship with. Like, I look at all those past partners and none of them would have been a good husband, the right husband. None of them are someone that I would have wanted to raise kids with. Like, they would have been the wrong person. And I want you to think about your past partners, every idiot, every loser you put up with, like every man that ever made you feel like an option. And think about what your future would have looked like. Finding the right love is absolutely worth the wait. And I never want to say, well, at least I found someone. You shouldn't either. I've said this in a past episode, but my worst nightmare is to be walking down the aisle at my wedding and everybody in the... Hello? Oh, I'm sorry. Are we needing to get comfortable? Okay. We're being a very big baby today, apparently, Rocco. I hope during episodes he really entertains you guys because he's just a big baby. He's just a baby. He's got daddy issues just like me. It's fine. You are such a goofy little dog. You know, I've said it that my worst nightmare in life is walking down the aisle at my wedding and my friends and family are like pitying me or they're taking bets on how long it is until we get divorced, or it feels like everybody in the room knows something that I don't. And I think this is why it's so important to confide in the people around you and like take their opinion on who you're dating. I'm not saying break up with them just because they tell you to, but 9 times out of 10, the people in our lives are seeing something that we don't because we're in, you know, we've got the rose-colored glasses on and we don't want to listen. And I think this is how we find ourselves repeating toxic cycles and dynamics, because at the end of the day, if these are people in your life that you trust and you value their opinion, if they're telling you, hey, this is not a good person, and they're getting the courage to say that to you, I think it's important that you at least hear them out. But anyways, it's no secret in today's dating world, we're all really struggling. We're all lonely. We're all feeling the effects of it. We're all like, oh my God, why didn't I find somebody by now? My parents had 2 kids by now. Like, there's a myriad of reasons as to why this has happened. And, you know, I've talked about all of them on the podcast before. This is not a new topic for here, but something I don't think I've talked enough about is how can we all show up better in dating? Because that's where the podcast came from. I started this podcast out of a need for healing for myself, but also of how was I showing up in relationships? How was I contributing to the toxic dynamics? Like, how did I, yes, it was their fault for treating me like shit, but I allowed them to treat me like shit because of the way I felt about myself, because of the things I thought about myself, because I thought that that's what you have to suffer for love. You don't have to suffer for love. You should never have to suffer to maintain a relationship. A relationship shouldn't cost you your sense of self. And so that's what this podcast formed out of. It was me needing to heal from all those things I learned, from all the wounds and all this stuff. So now it's about how can I show up better in dating? How can you show up better in dating? How can we all unlearn these toxic cycles and really start to make dating fun again? Oh my God. Maybe we put that on a red hat instead of a certain other phrase. Anyways, we all feel like people are inconsistent. There's no follow through. There's no communication, or there's really poor communication. They're playing these mind games. Like, you take 5 hours to answer. Well, I'm going to take 6 hours to answer. Like, it's all bullshit. And I feel like those are the top 3 complaints in modern dating: is the inconsistency, poor communication, and no follow through. And really what all that boils down to is the prevalence of dopamine driven seeking behavior. We've all been conditioned through social media, through dating apps, to seek these quick emotional highs with little to no investment in the other person. Can you stop, please, sir? I'm trying to record a podcast. Oh, now you got my makeup. Rocco, please, baby. I love you very much, but I need you to function like a normal dog. Do you guys see this? Like how he's sitting? This is ridiculous. Anyways, where was I? Oh yeah. little to no investment in the other person. And I think that's part of why limerence is so common, because people are pursuing the excitement, they're pursuing the feelings instead of actually pursuing the person. You know, they're pursuing this connection without any sort of emotional capacity or willingness to nurture that connection. You really need to be in that state in order to be able to sustain that connection. And I think when you get out of limerence and you're able to, you know, stop fantasizing about the person. Like, prime example, obviously I've told you guys, I went on a date on New Year's Eve. Mr. New Year's Eve and I hit pause on things for now. And I'm never going to tell you to wait for a man. I'm never going to say you should wait for a man. This is just what makes sense for me and him right now. He started a new job and has been working like a fucking dog, has had no time. Obviously I do what I do. I'm a freelancer, so I have a little more flexibility in my schedule, but we had a conversation last night and we decided it was the healthy thing to kind of just take pause for right now while he adjusts to this new job, this new schedule, this new routine, because he's been working 6 days a week and it's just been a lot for him. And it was, you know, it's a shit decision. Like, we've been having a lot of fun, but who knows? So we're going to hit pause. And I told him, balls in your court. You can reach out if and when you want to pick this back up. And that's that. And in the past, I would have spiraled about that. Oh my God, I'm not enough. He's not willing to prioritize me, blah, blah, blah. It's not that he's not willing. He wants to. He just physically can't right now. And it would cause, like, that's just the reality. And it sucks. But the fact that I've healed enough and he's healed enough in our own lives to be able to have that mature conversation just shows how important it is, because dating doesn't have to be this dramatic thing. It can just be as simple as, I really like you. I want to prioritize you. It's not fair of me to ask you to wait. Like, let's just hit pause. And it was a really good conversation. And honestly, like, it's one of those things where I'm like, I can't wait to tell my therapist about this because she's going to be so proud of how I handled it. But with limerence and just, you know, being able to show up better in dating, it's less about the lack of desire for connection, and it's more people's inability to sustain it because they haven't developed the skills to do so. They haven't met themselves deep enough to do so. They lack emotional regulation, emotional intelligence. They're just not, which these are all traits that are not previously cultivated in our society. They're becoming more common and more commonly discussed. And I think we're all feeling the effects of this shift. And I think that's part of why dating has got so hard, because again, it's like when you show up the party, right? No one wants to be the first person to show up at the party. So you plan on showing up at 8:15 and then someone else is like, oh, I'm going to show up at 8:30. So I'm not the person. Everyone's trying to not be the first person to show up at the party. Well, that's how I feel about modern dating and modern dating culture is everyone's too afraid to show up as themselves because they don't want to be rejected. They don't want to be perceived as too much, perceived as this, perceived as that. And it's like, how about we all just stop worrying about how we're being perceived and show up as ourselves, be intentional, be honest, communicate what we want and need, and other people will start to do the same. People will start to let their walls down again. I know I have. When I stopped apologizing for who I am, when I stopped apologizing for asking what I need and being like, if you can't meet me where I'm at, that's fine. I'm just, you know, we're not a match. It's changed the dating game. The guy I was seeing in the fall, I'm looking back at that now and seeing how much I did fall into limerence with that. And okay, bye, Rocco. And that's the thing is, I don't want you guys to think too that by going to therapy and healing that you're never going to struggle with these things again, that your anxious attachment is never going to be triggered. You're never going to struggle with limerence. You're never going to be love bombed again. Like, no, you can still do that and struggle with that. I know I did. I literally just did it in the fall. But it makes it makes your ability to discern the situation a lot stronger. And you can, I don't want to say bounce back, because it's not about bouncing back, but you can process it and move on better, healthier, stronger. You can take those lessons and understand and learn from it instead of internalizing it and like having some sort of guilt or shame around that situation. And I think that's more so what it's about. Another common question in dating is, how do I know if I've been in love? Have I ever been in love? I think that is something that we have all asked ourselves before, because just because you were in a relationship with because as horrible as this sounds, just because you were in a relationship with somebody doesn't necessarily mean you're actually in love with them. And I know that's probably hard to hear. And it also would suck to think like, wow, was I in a relationship with somebody who never loved me? I was. I don't think like my last boyfriend ever really loved me. He wanted control. He loved the idea of me. He loved the person he wanted to make me into, but he didn't love me, who I was at my core. And there's also that idea when something ends that it was a waste of our time. and that we wasted so much time investing in this person and I'm never going to love again and I'm never going to get hurt again, blah, 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 blah. Pain is a part of the human experience. Having pain and heartbreak is honestly one of the most beautiful things we can deal with in life. And I know maybe that sounds a little sadistic, sorry, but I just think that heartbreak shows that we cared so deeply about somebody that their absence feels like grief. So no, it's not a waste of time. Like, you can lose the person, but you can't lose what they brought out in you. If you saw the way somebody brought out the best in you or even the worst in you, that is a lesson to be remembered. Even if you never speak to them again, they block you on everything. You never hear from them again. You never cross paths with them again. You're blocked on everything, whatever it is. That was still time lived. It wasn't time lost. Every relationship, every friendship, everything teaches us something about ourselves. And the sooner you're able to process love in that regard, instead of internalizing it and internalizing that pain and that shame and that guilt and feeling like you failed. Again, maybe you did. Maybe you were the problem in that relationship. But what's important is how you learn from it and show up better for the next partner. We're never going to be the same person that we were before heartbreak. And that should be a good thing. Every heartbreak should change you for the better. I think that's like the beautiful thing about love that so many people get wrong is it's a beautiful thing to choose to love somebody with your whole heart without knowing what the future holds, without knowing if it's going to end in marriage or heartbreak, without knowing anything of what the future holds. And I think that's part of why so many people struggle to love now is, yes, we are dopamine driven and we want the payoff right away, but people are so focused on their life plans and their picture perfect plans. And instead of and how this person fits into that, instead of loving them in the moment, and you can figure out the rest later. And it's a brave thing to share the most vulnerable parts of yourself with somebody. It's a brave thing to choose to love somebody without any regard for the fact that I am giving you my heart and I know you can hurt me. That is a brave thing to do. You are like truly being in love with somebody means they see you for your best and for your worst, and they choose to love you anyways. And that is a very unnerving place to be. And that is truly so vulnerable. And I don't think people know how to do that anymore. People still perform in their own relationships so that this person perceives them however they want to be perceived. And that's, I think, also why a lot of relationships fail, because we're presenting this version of ourselves that doesn't actually exist. And eventually the cracks are going to form. I always say meant to be doesn't mean meant to last. I absolutely think there are versions of ourselves that can be loved by a person, but that person is not going to be capable of loving the future version of us, the version of ourselves that we're meant to become. So just because you had a very deep, intense love that seemed, the stuff that they write in fairy tales, it doesn't mean that it was meant to be the one. It doesn't mean that that was the person you were meant to spend your life with. It just means they were meant to love you in that moment, and that is okay. Because again, maybe they wouldn't be capable of loving the version of you that you grow into. Maybe they would have turned toxic and sabotaged your dreams. You just don't know. It's also entirely possible, like I said, just because you were in a relationship with somebody doesn't mean that they were in love with you. You can have love for somebody without actually being in love with them. Something I remember, like in the couple years following my college relationship, especially like the first year after, people would ask me like if I was still in love with him and if I would ever get back together with him, if he reached out and all that stuff. And to that, I always said, like, it's years later, I will always have love for him in my heart. I will always hold a special place for him in my heart because I consider my first love. And they always say you never forget your first love. And it's not that I still have feelings for him, but I will always have a warm, special place in my heart for him. I will always have respect for him. And that's what having love for somebody means. It means you have compassion, you have respect, you have appreciation, you want what's best for them. And it's more of an emotional appreciation and valuing of that person than a true emotional pull to that person like you feel when you're in love. When you're in love, it's about the desire for the person. It's, again, in the beginning, it will be more intense and it's going to fade over time. And I think that's where a lot of relationships tend to fall apart, because people mistake the fading of the feeling as your losing feeling. And I don't think that's always the case. I think why they fail is because people stop choosing love. There comes a point where love, the feeling, is no longer enough, and you have to actively choose to still be in a relationship and in love with that person. You still have to, pour into that person. You can't be complacent. Complacency and having love in a relationship go hand in hand. When complacency is where relationships go to die. And with the subject of being in love versus having love for somebody, is you have to be in a place to be loved. Because I know for me, I have a lot of love to give people. I love my people fiercely, deeply, loyally, not just romantically, but my friendships as well. And I know when I find my person, I'm going to have a lot of love to give them. But am I going to be in a place to receive the love that they have to give me? Am I going to want to be that vulnerable? Am I going to want to get deep emotionally? Like, you have to be in a place to receive love as much as you're ready to give it. And I think that's where some people go wrong in dating too, and why things fail is because you just get very uncomfortable and unnerved by people loving you. But I think overall with love and relationships, there's 3 big things that we need to remember in order to avoid situationships, limerence, all these things. And it's that chemistry doesn't mean compatibility. Attention and intention are not the same thing. And words mean nothing without the actions to back them up. And if you remember those 3 lessons, I think you can avoid falling into limerence or another situationship. So what is limerence? I said we're going to talk about the 3 L's. We talked about love. Do I really need to touch on lust? You guys get it. It means I want to fuck. That's what lust is. But with limerence, I think limerence often keeps us in a toxic situation, and I will touch on that in a second, but it's not just about obsession. Like, limerence is about obsession, but it's also a projection of our own desires, and it's a fantasizing about this person and the future we're going to have with them. And your mind is attaching to this person because of some unmet need within yourself. And this person is normally a placeholder for something that's missing or a core belief about yourself. So we attach ourselves to the idea of this person instead of looking at the person in front of us. And, maybe it's that you're lonely, you've lacked purpose in your life, you're just wanting a deeper connection, you just feel something in your life is feeling disconnected. And so you create a fantasy around this person that represents what you're craving. And I think this is a lot of the time too why people say, why some women date for the potential. And it's really just the limerence about this person, right? You're not actually even seeing the potential in this man. You're seeing the version of yourself you want this man to be, and you're mistaking that as potential. And so maybe sometimes even dating for potential is really just another form of limerence. But I know for me in my last relationship, a lot of my friends were like, why didn't you leave the first time he yelled at you? Why didn't you leave the second time he yelled at you? Why didn't you leave when he tried to control you? Why didn't you leave when he had a gun in your car? Why didn't you leave when he joked about sexually assaulting you in your sleep? Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you leave? And it's because and there's so many more reasons as to why I didn't leave, but I was just so in it, and I could not see past the man I knew he could be. And it was just really at its core limerence. And I was like, but for the first time in my life, someone sees me, they understand what I've been through. And I was so stuck in that. And I think that's why limerence often leads to toxic relationships, because you're blatantly overlooking so many red flags because you want that version of them that you've created about them. And for me personally, my anxious attachment and my struggles with limerence, obviously it really just, now we want to get under the blanket. Guys, look at this. This is ridiculous. This is what I have to do. He is a happy camper now. This is going to look weird. Where was I? My anxious attachment was always just, for me, the core wound was feeling like I'm not enough for people and not being chosen. And that's for me why Rocco, buddy, can you please? I know you want to be held right now, but I'm trying to record. Okay. Do we see the baby? You're just a very big baby. I'm probably covered in dog hair right now. For me, with my anxious attachment, my mood would always depend on how quickly they responded and the attention they gave me, or if they were in a bad mood. The limerence, it was like an addictive mindset. But something I had to learn is I got myself into it and I can get myself out of it. And with all that being said, I think, how do we avoid limerence? How do we spot it? How do we call it out in ourselves? And like I said, my anxious attachment was about this core belief of, I'm not enough for people. And like I said, I'm 27 now. And there was a time in my life I really thought I would be married now. And I know a lot of women feel this way too. And the thing is, I know in my heart I'm going to find that person. I know in my heart I'm going to fall in love again one day. I know in my heart that somebody is out there for me who's going to love me so fully and deeply. And for me, the anxious attachment, it used to bleed into all aspects of my life, romantic, my friendships, even my family. So I know that is going to happen, and that's just not part of my story right now. And maybe you're like me and it's just not part of your story right now too. But the thing is, some women will let that paralyze them, and they will sit and wait for their Prince Charming, and they won't go live. They'll put their life on pause until they get that person, and their singleness is a waiting room. But for majority of women, that's not the case for anymore. And for me, I know I would not be the woman that my future person wants if I was waiting. The man I'm meant to be with would not want me to have put my dreams on hold. He would not want me to have not lived my life. I would not be the woman who he would fall for because I wouldn't be me. And that is, I think, a lesson that I have to carry, especially when it comes to limerence, because limerence fades when you no longer need the fantasy. And limerence is why you keep ending up in situationship after situationship after situationship, because you are just sticking around waiting for this version of them to show up, and you're waiting for them to be the person that you think they should be, and that's not the person in front of you. So some steps, if you feel like you're in limerence in a situation, first things first, you need to be proactive with your thoughts. You need to stop fantasizing about the person, and do that by whatever means necessary, whether that's journaling your feelings out, writing it all down. Maybe you mute them on social media, because we're cutting the dopamine source. We're not checking old texts. We're not checking their social media. We're not checking their stories. None of it. You also have to, this is going to require some intrinsic work, but you need to assess their emotional capacity. How deeply has this person met themselves, and does it line up with how deeply you've met yourself? How do they communicate? How do they take accountability? Are they only good to you when they're in a good mood and things are easy peasy? Or, how do they show up when their schedule gets busy, when life gets hard? Like, how do they show up for you? Because a person who can't take accountability is someone who is not worth being with. And if they're only good to you when they're in a good mood, you're in for a bumpy ride in life. You are going to be in for a very, very hard life. I learned that firsthand. I witnessed it in my parents' marriage. Like, you have to stop dating for the potential of who somebody can be, because you don't know if they're going to reach that version of themselves. Also, who says they can even be that person? You're not in their head. Like, I remember I've said this before on the podcast, but I said in my last relationship to my ex, like, you can be a good partner if you go to therapy and you fix your shit. I don't think he ever did that, even though he promised me he would. And so I don't know who he is today and how he shows up for his partner, but that's not my problem anymore. It's hers. 9 times out of 10, when somebody moves on, it's not that they've changed for the better. It's that they've found someone who's going to tolerate their bullshit. And that person is no longer you. As much as we should want our exes to have healed and be better to the next person, most of the time they didn't actually do that work. And that's a really sad reality. And I think that's why so many people end up with broken hearts. Because again, we are not responsible for the things that were done to us. We are not responsible for how we've been hurt in the past, but we are responsible for how those wounds manifest in future relationships, in our friendships. We are responsible for the ways that our wounds bleed onto other people. That is what we are responsible for. And, if you find something else with limerence, is you need to stop thinking of what could have been. I know we could have been great. I know we could have had this great relationship. No, you don't. You need to start reminding yourself of what actually happened, what actually took place, who they actually were, how they showed up for you. Like, that's how you have to approach dealing with limerence. And this is going to be a message to the men out there, because I've seen a lot of men on social media talking about how dating feels transactional, how they are just feeling so lonely and all that stuff. If you are a man who is feeling lost in dating, I would really encourage you to stop listening to other men and start listening to women. Hear women, hear their stories, and don't get defensive about it. If your response to women is something like, well, it's not all men, right there, you need to put your ego aside and start listening. Because yes, it's not all men, but it's always a man. And 9 times out of 10, the men that man surrounds himself with are feeding and enabling the issue at hand. Listen to the reasons women value their independence and stop looking at it as a negative or it's somehow a threat to you. Because I find that the same men who degrade a woman's independence are the same ones who also talk about how women are gold diggers, how transactional dating is, all that stuff. If you're a man who willingly uses women for their bodies, you can't be shaming a woman who is going to dinner with a guy and just wants a free meal. Relationships of the past were entirely transactional. Women couldn't choose out of alignment. They had to choose out of necessity because they couldn't have their own bank accounts. They couldn't buy property. All of the things that a man has never had to bat an eye at because they were his inherent right, basically since birth, women had to fight for. I know one day I'm going to find that person. I'm going to fall in love again, and I'm going to love them so deeply and fiercely and loyally because that is who I've always been. I have refused to let the heartbreak that I've experienced, the toxic men that I've experienced, the abusive men that I've experienced, I have refused to let them take my big heart, my empathy, and my emotional vulnerability from me. And the thing that I have changed about myself, and I hope other women listening do this as well, is you can still be a soft, romantic, hopeless romantic lover girl, but that loyalty and love should be reserved for the man who gives you clarity, not confusion. For a lot of women, marriage used to be out of necessity. Now it's an act of charity. And women are not PR reps for mediocre men. I can't tell you how many times I see on social media women posting these videos of their husbands and boyfriends doing some fucked shit on the internet. And then people are like, well, why are you still with him? You're enabling his bad behavior. And they're like, well, he really is good, blah, blah, blah. Then why did you post that on the internet? I didn't expect it to blow up. Come on. I hate that shit. But speaking of being a PR rep for a mediocre man, I am no longer a fan of the Diary of a CEO podcast. And I chose to include this topic in this episode, not only because this episode that I'm going to discuss has resurfaced, but I think it falls into the limerence, lust, love conversation because we're of course going to deal with incels again. But I don't think we have a male loneliness epidemic. I think we have an epidemic of undateable men. And this Diary of a CEO episode, if you don't already know what I'm talking about, you are about to. It was with Dr. K. It was essentially intellectual red pill content. And the clip that resurfaced, I think it's interesting because the clip resurfaced on a different account. The Diary of a CEO account never posted this clip, rightfully so, because again, the backlash that he's received. But in it, Stephen Bartlett asked if society should intervene to make sure men meet women. And this is going to be the direct quote. This is the direct quote. We're going to have a lot of men who are disillusioned, that become incels, find themselves in pockets of the internet, are resentful, all those kinds of things. But should society intervene to course correct that? Should we put systems in place to make sure that those men meet partners? No. The only intervening that society should do is putting systems in place that hold men accountable, teach them how to be better partners, teach them how to be in touch with their emotions and intellectually and emotionally available. Teach them how to be better people so that there's somebody that a woman would want to be with. We should be educating men about incel and far-right propaganda and the hatred towards women and anything that will hold men accountable for their behaviors rather than perpetuating this narrative that somehow women are responsible for a man's behavior. Men are not entitled to pass on their genes or have a legacy. In fact, if anything, we learned about this in schools, natural selection. Hello, we're weeding this shit out. But they're not entitled to any of that. In that question that Stephen Bartlett asked, there was a more just silent, concerning, and honestly dangerous and sinister question that I heard. And it was that, should men's desire to reproduce be prioritized over a woman's bodily autonomy and consent? And while both Stephen Bartlett and the guest, Dr. K, agreed like, oh, no, it shouldn't. The way that they phrased it was that they said, we both agree that this is correct. But they didn't say outright, like, no, men are not entitled. They still posed this question. And the fact that they posed that question, were editing the episode and still chose to air it shows so much. But there's no oppression for men who are not being chosen in the dating pool. There's no, like, they're not entitled. And it's always about a man's legacy and passing on his genes instead of him just being a father and raising a child. It's weird. It's weird. It's creepy. It's gross. Like, I hate freaking, ugh. Like, a man's inability to find a partner is not some sort of social injustice, the way that a lot of these conversations and podcasts phrase it to be. And something else in that episode too that they were discussing is how they were like, well, men are told to be more emotional, but then we're not allowed to show anger. Anger is an emotion. Anger can be scary. You know, when a woman cries, doesn't often lead to violence. Anger does. Like, something that I will say men, for the sake of this conversation, but people in general need to grasp is that your emotions are valid. Your emotions are valid, but your responses and your actions are not always. Like, men are allowed to be angry, but what is not allowed is the way that they use that anger, is that they're yelling at their wife or their partner. They're screaming. They're throwing things. They punch holes in walls. And all of that is under the guise of, well, he's a man, boys will be boys. And in that same context, though, like in that same conversation, they said, well, most domestic violence is statistically perpetuated by men, but why can't men be emotional? You said it yourself. There's two different sets of circumstances when it comes to a woman crying versus a man being angry. And the fact that we're having these conversations and we're so flippantly discussing these things and we're undermining the serious nature of them is so disheartening, especially for a podcast of Stephen Bartlett's size. I mean, millions of people are listening to these things, and they are hearing the ways in which they are undermining how serious these issues are for women. And instead, they're trying to make it out like men are the victims. Men set the system up. And now that the system is no longer working for men, the patriarchy is no longer working for men, and they're suffering because of it, like women said they would, now it's an issue, but it's somehow still a woman's fault. Men's mental health, the male loneliness, the rate of male suicide, these are all serious issues. Yes, they deserve attention, they deserve concern, and they deserve awareness. But control over women is not and has never been and never will be the answer to solve these things. That was a pretty heavy way to end this episode. I'm, if you guys can't tell, a little heated about watching that full episode. But back to, I will say, is I think every person who is a good person, who is in touch with themselves, who has done the work on themselves, deserves a healthy, loving relationship. But you have to be in the place to be a healthy and loving partner, to not only be worthy of that, but to have that kind of relationship. It takes two to tango. And a lot of these men, they don't know, they're not in touch with those parts of themselves. And I think the really uncomfortable thing here too is I see men always being like, therapy didn't work for me. Therapy doesn't work. People in general love to say therapy doesn't work. 9 times out of 10, the reason therapy didn't work for you is because once you left that therapist's office, you didn't think about anything that they said and you didn't do any of the actual work. The actual work on yourself begins outside of your therapist's office. And that was something I didn't grasp for a long time, because my therapist now I've been with her for years, and it took a long time. Finding a good therapist is a lot like dating. Sometimes it's trial and error until you find the right one. And if you're someone that is struggling in dating so much, like, you probably have a wound that you haven't faced. Even people with the seemingly best childhoods can have some sort of wound that they need to heal from. But like I've always said meant to be doesn't mean meant to last. But I want to put it in plainer terms for the girls out there, that just because the guy is a good guy doesn't mean he is the right guy. And that is perfectly okay. I think too, that's why women stay stuck and they settle. And then down the line, things get bad because we know in our hearts that this isn't our person. But and again, I'm not trying to encourage people to be endlessly looking and constantly seeking what's somebody better. Like, that's not what I'm encouraging here. And I know people take it that way. But if you know in your heart something is not right in your relationship, you know there's pieces of yourself that you're going to have to sacrifice to make this relationship work, I would strongly encourage you to reevaluate that relationship. Not especially in friendships too. This goes for friendships as well. Like, our lives are so fleeting, and love is one of the most beautiful parts of the human experience. It is so complex. It is so deep. It is why they've made a million TV shows and written a million books about it, because it is just a beautiful thing. But it's no secret that dating apps and social media have hijacked it a little bit. But I think it's also revealed a lot about us as humans, because again, women can now choose. We have more freedom. Like, I think these things were kind of inevitable in order to have a society that's progressing. And, again, people love to romanticize the old relationships, traditional relationships, but you know how many of those wives were actually Black widows and just all those things. I mean, I could keep going on and on, but like I said, 3 L's: limerence, lust, and love. Again, the love at first sight feeling, that's just lust. That's not love, it's lust. Lust can turn into love, but it can also very quickly turn into limerence. It's on you to be a strong enough woman and strong enough person to navigate that relationship accordingly. And I will leave it there. Thank you guys for listening to this week's episode of Not the Girl Next Door. I hope you enjoyed this one. I also hope you enjoyed my sleeping child in my arms. Rocco is, in fact, the star of this show, and I'm just here. It is his world. I am just living in it. But that's all for this week. Make sure you guys subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, wherever you're listening. Also, please leave us a 5-star review. It really helps. You can follow us on Instagram at Not the Girl Next Door Podcast. Also on TikTok. All of the links that you need to sign up for the Snail Mail Club will be linked in this episode, also in the Instagram bio. And I will see you guys next week for another episode. Bye for now.